It's the Growing for Market podcast.
I thought, we're not farming to make a killing. We want to make a living. But I was worried we couldn't even make a living on a third of an acre in size. And I was worried that we wouldn't be able to service our customers on that small of piece of land. I was worried we wouldn't find enough customers within a mile and a half of our farm, and on and on. I had all these doubts in my mind that this experiment would work, and every single one of them turned out I was wrong. We were able to find plenty of customers within a mile and a half of here. We were able to grow more food on this 1/3 of an acre with better focus than we were growing on 1 acre of land with shrewder techniques, with better growing techniques, and with lean thinking.
Hello, and welcome to the Growing for Market podcast, where we talk about growing, marketing, and the business of growing vegetables and flowers for local markets like farmers markets, CSAs, farm stands, and local wholesaling. I'm Andrew Mefford, your host and the editor of Growing for Market magazine. For 32 years, the only magazine devoted solely to flower and vegetable market farmers. If you're enjoying the podcast, just wait till you see the magazine. Go to growingformarket.com for more. Also, if you could give us a follow and a rating, it really helps other like-minded people find the podcast. Today's episode of the Growing for Market podcast is brought to you by BCS America. On our farm, we've had our BCS two-wheel tractor for over a decade, and with no belts to slip, its all-gear-driven construction is still going strong. Though we originally got it for rototilling, we kept it even when we went mostly no-till because it can do so many other things around the farm. From snow blowing, to making raised beds with the rotary plow, to chipping wood, it can do just about anything you might need on a farm with the right attachment. Need to shred a cover crop? A BCS flail mower will make quick work of even the most vigorous cover crop and chop it up so it breaks down quickly. Want to stir in compost or amendments without inverting soil layers? A power harrow turns your BCS into a precise tilthing machine with depth control so you don't mix deeper than you want to. With so many attachments to choose from, it truly is the Swiss Army knife of farm implements. It's why, instead of saying two-wheel tractor, so many people just say BCS. Tractors and attachments are on sale through the end of the year. Visit bcsamerica.com to find sale pricing and your nearest dealer. Every fall on our farm, we order a couple sling bags of Fort V potting soil from Vermont Compost. Over the years, we've tried a lot of the compost and potting soil options out there, from making our own to buying off the shelf. And we keep coming back to Vermont Compost, both for overall quality and batch-to-batch consistency. It's that consistency that keeps us coming back. There are so many variables that affect how good your seedlings are. We know Vermont Compost will give our plants the best possible foundation, so we can stick to worrying about all the other stuff and not the potting soil. With Vermont Compost Company's pre-buy program, you can receive 15% off on orders placed, paid for, and shipped by December 21st. Listeners of the Growing for Market podcast will receive an additional 5%, bringing the total discount to 20%. Visit vermontcompost.com/GFM for more details or mention this podcast when you place your order. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Ben Hartman to the podcast. So, welcome, Ben, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Ben runs Clay Bottom Farm in the city of Goshen, Indiana, farming on 1/3 of an acre of land in the city. Ben is also the author of the books The Lean Farm, How to Minimize Waste, Increase Efficiency, and Maximize Value and Profits with Less Work. A couple years later, he came out with The Lean Farm Guide to Growing Vegetables, more in-depth lean techniques for efficient organic production, which got really specific with how to implement lean practices on a vegetable farm. And later on this November, his third book will be coming out, The Lean Micro Farm, How to Get Small, Embrace Local, Live Better, and Work Less. And I'll say, I just finished reading my advanced copy and I really enjoyed it and found it inspiring that we might be able to do a similar kind of thing with our own farm. The Lean Micro Farm is on pre-sale now based on a November 30th release date, but we get our copies straight from the publisher. So if you're interested in what we discussed today, head on over to growingformarket.com, pre-order it, and we'll send it to you as soon as we get our copies direct from the publisher. And if you're a Growing for Market magazine subscriber, remember to log in before buying the book because GFM subscribers always get 20% off all the books we sell. An excerpt from the book is in the current November magazine. We'll make it public at the website growingformarket.com and put a link to that in the show notes so anyone can read it. Now, Ben has also developed an online course in lean farming. So if you're more of a video person or want to get really in depth on this stuff, you can find that at claybottomfarm.com. Longtime Growing for Market magazine readers will be well acquainted with Ben, having written articles about the lean system for Growing for Market as early as 2013, which is where I first learned about you and the concept of lean. It's worth pointing out that your current clay bottom farm is the third and smallest iteration of clay bottom farm. I feel like this book explains both why you wanted to shrink the farm in the first place and how you got your farm down to 1/3 of an acre without taking reductions in your income. In fact, Ben, if you don't mind, I'd like to read a couple sentences from the introduction that I feel like really explain the changes you've made over the years. Do you mind if I read an excerpt from your book back to you?
No, go ahead. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh yeah, I'm really stoked to have this conversation. I've been reading your stuff for a decade now, and so I don't think we've ever met in person, so it's fun to at least meet digitally. I hope we run into each other at a conference or traveling or something one of these days. But all right, so this is from the introduction of the Lean Micro Farm, How to Get Small, Embrace Local, Live Better, and Work Less. And Ben, even though we are encouraging people to read the book, I thought you do such a good job there in the introduction, just I feel like encapsulating the changes that you made to your farm over the years. I just want to read these few sentences because I feel like it's going to put us right at smack in the context of what we're talking about today. So here in the introduction, you're talking about how you've shrunk your farm down to 1/3 of an acre. And you say, quote, "We now sell all our food within 1.5 miles of the farm. We switched to a no-till deep mulch system utilizing 4 inches of compost on the soil's surface. Instead of feeding our plants minerals that were mined and shipped from far away, we now rely only on our own compost made from local leaves for fertility. We use just 7 field tools to complete most work. We still grow a wide range of crops, but chose 5 focus crops. All of our crops are grown within 60 steps of our barn house. Yet while our farm is smaller and we work less, we earn as much as before." All right, that right there. That's from the introduction, and I thought that's just so pithy and gets to the point of what this book is all about. I just wanted to read that. And obviously that is not a green screen behind you, folks. That's the farm, right? We're looking at it, right, Ben?
Yeah, that's it. This is growing on 15,000 square feet. And there are 2 greenhouses also. And I'll shift over so your viewers can get a full view.
Okay. Hi, farm. Hi, Clay Bottom Farm. Okay. All right. Well, yeah, let's get into it, Ben. Without any further ado, welcome to the podcast, Ben Hartman.
Well, thank you. Growing for Market is one of very few publications that I read cover to cover every month. And it has been foundational to leaning up our farm. There's nothing lean about not knowing how to grow. And having the technical expertise is absolutely essential in this business. So thank you for putting that resource together.
It's our pleasure. I know Lynn was the editor back when you started writing for the magazine in 2013, and she saw a lot of value in your work, and we still do. So, and thank you for the kind words on the magazine. We do try to make it valuable. We, as you point out in the book, only about 1.3%, it's almost like 1% of the population is doing the farming. And I figure we're pretty spread out. And I think it's an important way because, as you know, you're an innovative farmer. I think farmers are innovative, and it's important to connect us up because we're pretty far flung. I'm glad it's been useful.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned how few of us are now farming, and I do want to zoom in, and we can talk more in particular about how we set up this 1/3 acre farm. However, it's important, I think, to zoom out too and recognize some trend lines in small scale agriculture in the U.S. And since between 2011 and 2018, we lost over 100,000 small farms. And if you do the math, that's over 1,000 farms a month go out of business. And so there's a sense when you look at these larger numbers, by the end of this century, globally, not just in the US, the University of Colorado just came out with a study that showed that on the current trend lines, if the current trend lines continue, we'll have half the number of farms, and farms will be twice the size that they are. And that's coming right around the corner. In 1960 in the US, half of us were farming. Okay, just over more than half the population was farming. And as you say, we're down to less than 1%. And so I love growing for market. I love the small farm community. And there's a growing impending sense that we're a bit on the Titanic here. The trend lines are not favorable for small farmers. And the only way to get in, the only way to really engage in agriculture is to be shrewd and lean and to start on a small scale. And that's part of my motivation to write these books because I love this career. It's a beautiful way to make a living. There's nothing more rewarding than what we're doing, and I want more people to be able to experience it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people do get into farming because of they like the lifestyle. Nobody gets into farming because they want to do accounting or make marketing pitches or whatever. But, the thing is, if you can't farm efficiently and do all the other stuff of writing of running a business, obviously you're not going to stay in farming. If you can't do all the other stuff that you didn't come to the lifestyle for, you still got to do it. So I think that's where being lean and efficient comes into it. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I feel like the overarching theme of your writing and farming has been stripping farming, which, like any business, can get needlessly complicated, back to the essentials. And a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with your writing and with lean principles, but for those who aren't, can you explain what lean principles are and how they apply to farming? And I realize this is the subject of multiple books and you've got a course and everything, but can you just give us the Reader's Digest version for those who are like, what is this lean thing that we're talking about?
Okay, so I've been rereading the Tao Te Ching just in all the free time that I have, and really, the Tao Te Ching was this book of ancient wisdom that was inspirational for many spiritual traditions, Shintoism, Buddhism, many others. And lean is really a system that grew out of Japanese philosophy, and so the Tao Te Ching in some ways directly informed it. And there are many quotes from the Tao that really line up directly with what's going on with some of this lean stuff. One of them is the reward of good work is productivity. And so this is ancient wisdom. There's recognition that to perform good work is synonymous with productivity. And it's often assumed that if you're going to be organic, sustainable, and small scale, working with hands and with simple tools, that there's a lack of productivity. But really the opposite is true. Good work is productive work. And we can be good. We can do good work on a small scale working with our hands. And I want to explain the philosophy behind that in my books, but I also want to explain the technique, because if you can't put that philosophy into action, then it's just a bunch of hot air. But you asked what the lean system is. Essentially what it comes down to is there's a coin, and there are two sides to the coin. On one side, and so this is to say you're only ever doing two things on your farm. You're either adding value for your customer. And what is value? Value is what do they want, when do they want it, and how much. Okay? Precise, you need a precise definition of value, and you need to get that information from your customer. Taiichi Ohno at Toyota, who helped implement the lean system at Toyota, used to say the customer is the only one allowed to define value. Okay, you're not allowed to. Your salesperson, the seed catalog's not allowed to. The tool company's not allowed to. The customer defines value. So you start with the customer and work backwards from there. So that's on the one side of the coin. You're adding value to your product. On the other side of the coin is what the Japanese call muda, which roughly translates to waste. However, really it's any activity that's not tangibly adding value to your product. And I say tangibly because touch is important. This is, when did you touch the seed, put it in the ground? When did you harvest the crop? When did you wash the crop? When did you package the crop and move it closer to the customer? These are physical touches on the product that cause the value to go up. Everything else on your farm is muda. There are only about 4 or 5 activities that add value, and a whole lot of bull. I said I wouldn't cuss too much, but a whole lot of muda on the farm. Just a lot of waste. And it's even true on our farm, even now. Lots of our activities are in that muda category. Doing your taxes is muda. Accounting is muda. A lot of stuff that you have to do, ordering seeds is muda. Reading books is muda. All that research, it's important to do, but it's not directly adding value to your customer. So you need to be what they call suspicious about those activities. And too many farmers haven't been trained to put that set of eyeglasses on to recognize, when am I adding value and when am I spinning my wheels and generating muda. So in English, we have the word waste, but muda is a more nuanced concept. And I hope you're understanding the nuances here. But there are 7 types of waste, or muda, from the original lean system. And whereas we only have one waste concept, there's the waste of overproduction, overtransportation, excess motion, and so on and so forth. And my books delineate these wastes and give lots of examples of how we've found them, certainly on our farm, and have made attempts to root them out of our farm. This latest book and this newest farm that we're on here is my attempt to strip back everything that's absolutely non-essential and farm at the bare bones, so to speak, as simply as we can.
Okay. And I enjoyed hearing about that journey in your book. In fact, there's a few times in there where you point out that you farm with your wife, Rachel. It's Rachel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and talk. There are a number of times where you say that she sounds like she was exerting a especially a smalling influence. I don't know what to call it. Like she was trying to really cut back to the least, and it made you a little bit nervous even. And it sounds like you did really cut it down to, like you say, about a third of an acre there. And it sounds like it worked out.
So Rachel has lean instincts. She is by nature lean in her thinking and her philosophy. And I, on the other hand, I have to read a pile of books and go to conferences, and it just takes me years for even simple concepts to soak in. But so she was, it's to her credit. Well, let me back up a bit and say that we began as an urban multi-plot farm. When we were first married about 20 years ago, we started a small farm in Goshen, and it was the land next to our house was a clay bottom tennis court, and we tilled in that tennis court to plant our first vegetables, and that's where our farm name comes from. We filled up that tennis court, we're selling everything out of it, and we started renting plots around town, and we did that for 3 or 4 years until we got sick of throwing tools in the back of a bicycle cart or in the back of the truck, and not being able to put up hoop houses and the infrastructure we needed to run a proper farm. And so we bought 5 acres about 10 miles outside of town, and we farmed there for 9 years. And we screwed up a lot on that farm. We overworked ourselves, and we still had a get big mindset for most of that time, which is to say, I grew up on a corn and soybean farm. So in Indiana, you get bigger every year, or you're out of business. You have to grow more corn, you rent more land, bigger tractor, more grain bins. And those farmers who are not on that track are going to be out of business. That's simply the way economics work around here. And that's the mindset I had. And we were putting up 1 greenhouse every growing season, expanding our acreage every year, selling to more customers, growing more food. Every season was more complex. And our hourly wage is probably going down every year as we got bigger and more complex. And we had a greenhouse one summer blow on top of our barn roof. And because it was poorly constructed, we were in a hurry, growing as fast as we could. And that was a demoralizing moment and a financial cost. And we thought, okay, if we're going to continue, we can't keep literally having our farm being blown up here. We're going to have to get lean and smart and shrewd. And one of our CSA customers at the time, Steve Brennan was his name, he sent an email to me and said, hey, we love your food, and I would love to, we use the lean system and our aluminum trailer company that he owned. He said, I'd love to come out and explore with you whether some of these concepts would work on a small farm. And we took him up on the offer and turned our farm a completely different trajectory. And that's where the book, The Lean Farm, comes out of that experience. And very shortly, actually, after writing The Lean Farm, after publication, we sold that farm and moved. And to be honest, it was to Rachel's credit. Whenever we've moved, she's been the one behind that, making sure that we're in the right place for what we want to be doing. And our son, Arlo, was born in 2014. Our second son, Leander, born in 2016. And which is the year the book was released. And we were wondering whether we were in the right place to be raising kids. And so we moved primarily to be closer to resources for kids. Rachel has sisters here, and Goshen's a college town of about 40,000 here in Indiana. And it was also an opportunity to start over. We had, the old farm was an Amish dairy farm that we converted to vegetable production. And this new farm, to be honest, was a blank slate, bare land. And so this was a chance to build a lean farm from the start, to build the infrastructure we really wanted that would set us on this smaller and smarter path that we wanted to continue on.
And now let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free. I am so excited to welcome Bootstrap Farmer as a sponsor of the podcast. I've known them for a dozen years, and if anyone tells you nothing is made in the USA anymore, well, they're headquartered and warehoused in Paris, Texas. They make their own all-metal, all-inclusive greenhouse frames of steel made in the USA and fabricated in Texas, and their heavy-duty, reusable propagation and microgreens trays are Midwest-made. With a complete range of supplies, they have just about everything for propagation and growing, including heat mats, ground cover, frost blankets, silage tarps, irrigation, and trellising. Want to color code your seed starting flats? They've got heavy-duty trays that will last for years in a full range of colors, great for keeping farm seedlings separate from retail or just for fun. And they have an experienced team of growers to support everything they sell. If you've heard of the NRCS High Tunnel Initiative providing grants for hoop houses, but have been put off by the paperwork, Bootstrap Farmer has a guide that will walk you through the application process so you can get your hoop house funded this winter. For all that and more, check out Bootstrap Farmer at bootstrapfarmer.com. And now, back to the show.
So it was a year or so after we moved, my publisher, Chelsea Green, Ben Watson, he called me up and he said, "Hey, you wrote this book and then you moved." And I'm not chastising you over that, but I'm actually interested in it and let's stay in touch. And he did stay in touch over the years and said that we'd love to have another book that tells the story of Lean 2.0. How'd you take these concepts and build a brand new farm and also make the case for small scale agriculture at the same time?
Okay. And can you tell us why you wanted to shrink your farm in the first place and how you used lean principles to get there then, since that's basically the story of this book?
Sure. So there are three basic principles that we used when we set out to move. Well, first of all, we reread E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, which is a wonderful book of macroeconomics, but there are lots of nuggets, very practical nuggets in there that mesh very well with the lean system. And since we wanted to shrink the size of our farm and work with a different economic mindset, that book became very inspirational and instrumental and intangibly instrumental in how we set up our farm here and chose our tools and so forth. But essentially, the first thing we did was we pulled out a giant sheet of paper and we tacked it up on a wall in our house. And we decided to define enough. Okay, and this is directly inspired from E.F. Schumacher here, but we drew circles around basic activities of our life and business. So there's a circle labeled farmer's market. There's one labeled CSA, one labeled bookkeeping or accounting, and so on and so forth. And we decided, and we had difficult, long conversations about, well, how much is enough? How many are enough CSA customers? How many weeks at farmer's market is enough? How much income is enough? And how many hours per week is enough to devote to this activity? Because we wanted to be working, ideally fewer than 35 hours a week, have plenty of time to spend with kids and go on camping trips, pursue other interests that we hadn't quite been able to do at the old farm. And having kids really was a shift, to be honest, and pushed us in this direction to really discipline ourselves to be more shrewd and smart with our time and energy and resources. And to be quite honest, we're approaching middle age too, and recognizing we can't just keep working 60 hours a week. Our bodies aren't going to permit it. And so to be smarter physically with how we work. And that was important too in how we set up this new farm. So defining enough was important. And what we decided out of that conversation was some of these things you mentioned. We decided we will draw a circle around our farm and sell all of our food within Goshen. No more driving to Elkhart, South Bend, Chicago, these further away places. We're going to hyper-localize here and stay in Goshen. And then number two, we said we'd, whatever it took, schedule ourselves so we're not working more than 35 hours a week. And we said we would shrink our farm to grow on a third of an acre in size instead of 1 acre in size, in part because we wanted to be better focused. And if we're going to cut the hours we're putting in, we'd have to cut the amount of space that we're growing on too. So as you mentioned, I was nervous. I'm the anxious one in our family. And I was nervous it wouldn't pan out. I thought, we're not farming to make a killing. We want to make a living. But I was worried we couldn't even make a living on a third of an acre in size. And I was worried that we wouldn't be able to service our customers on that small of piece of land. I was worried we wouldn't find enough customers within a mile and a half of our farm, and on and on. I had all these doubts in my mind that this experiment would work, and every single one of them turned out I was wrong. We were able to find plenty of customers within a mile and a half of here. We were able to grow more food on this 1/3 of an acre with better focus than we were growing on 1 acre of land with shrewder techniques, with better growing techniques, and with lean thinking.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad that you mentioned in the book that at least some of your thoughts about shrinking the farm came when you guys had kids, because I think that's a real turning point for a lot of people. Like I remember, like I would guess that we're probably a similar age, not that it really matters, but I remember when my wife and I, when we first started our farm, we were just like, we're all in, we're going to do whatever it takes, right? Like any business, like you got to do whatever it takes to keep the business moving. And so it meant working more than 40 hours a week every week. And I remember having the conversation with her. Kids were in our long-term plan and saying like, well, when we have kids, we're not going to be able to just work all the time, which is unfortunate that it had to take talking about having kids to have that conversation, right? Because in retrospect, we were on the burnout train. We were straight for burning ourselves out. And so I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that's a turning point for a lot of people in farming, especially, or not, of like, oh, okay, we can't just spend all of our time working. We have to do other things with our kids. So I think the smart thing for people to do would be to read your book and plan to not kill themselves the first few years and then decide to avoid burnout. Plan to be smart and efficient from the beginning. In the book, you talk about setting boundaries and leveraging those constraints in order to create the farm that you want. One of your boundaries being to work 35 hours a week in order to leave time for family and everything else that gets left behind when we work too much. My question for you is, how often do you hit that target? I mean, are there weeks in July and August where you're over that number of hours and just keep pushing? You're like, well, it's July and August. Or are you usually hitting those kinds of targets for how much you want to work?
Yeah, I'll be honest that we actually are hitting those targets, but it's because we have two part-time staff who have been, one who's been with us since we started this new farm for about 4 years. And the other has been with us for 2 growing seasons. And without excellent staff backing us up, we wouldn't be able to hit those targets.
But I think it's good of you to give credit to them, but it's also credit to you for that being part of your planning. Because when we first started, it was just me and my wife, and then we had apprentices and things like that. But I think that's part of the plan, is to say, like, okay, the farm needs to be of whatever size to support, let's say, the 2 primaries at 35 hours a week, and then to support salaries for the other people who help us get things done.
So one of the specific ways we make that happen with our staff is, I knew that for me, as a challenge for me, was to be in enough contact with our chefs and stay on top of my seeding calendar and the growing. I do most of the growing out here on the farm that you see behind you. I put the seeds in, I do most of the bed preparation. And we have a college student who helps us every summer with mostly with harvesting and delivery tasks. But I knew on this new farm, we wanted to hire someone at a management level position to do these, I don't want to say more important management level tasks, but to say, to do customer relations and to keep the farm organized managerially so that I can focus on growing, which is what my forte is and what I enjoy doing. And so what Nicole does is staff person with her part-time, who's a farm manager. She has actually 2 kids at home. They're homeschooling their kids. She does most of her work from home. She comes to the farm only half a day to maybe 1 day a week. And what she does is, for example, with our CSA program, Rachel and I said, we wanted X number of CSA customers, and we want our season to begin here and to end here. And she does everything else. She finds the CSA customers. She collects all the money. She drives to the farm on CSA delivery day, picks up the food and delivers it directly to their porch. And so it takes all the managerial work out of it so we can focus on being as productive as we can here on the farm. And that's made a world of difference in terms of keeping our hours in check too.
Great. Okay, so yeah, let's talk about your markets. Are all your CSA shares delivered to the customer?
Okay, so I had to answer your question. Yeah, that's true. But to answer your question at a more theoretical level, the first thing we did was define enough on our farm. And the second was to essentialize our farm. And what that means is we use the Pareto principle, which is to say that Pareto said that 20% of your time, effort, money, investments are probably producing 80% of the results. And the other 80% of your time, efforts, investments, whatever, are producing the other 20%. So we said, okay, who are our 20% customers? Which 20% of our customers are providing 80% of our income? And which 20% of our crops are providing probably 80% of our revenues? Okay, so we're ruthless and shrewd when we move, because we're going from 1 acre to a third of an acre. We're going to have to focus on the cream at the top, so to speak. So what we did was actually decided to sell only to restaurants, and there were just 2 that we really focused on. There were about 5 that we sell to in total, but 2 where we really meet with the chefs, really hone in on what they want, when they want it, how much, and we're really a behind the scenes farm for a couple of wholesale accounts here in Goshen. And it is incredible how much one restaurant will sell in a year. And these aren't giant, New York City restaurants here either. We're just a small college town, like I said. But if you can take the time to really learn and really co-create your farm with the chef, there's a lot of food that even one restaurant will go through. And so we have, like I said, have had no problem finding accounts here using the Genchi Genbutsu, this lean approach, this lean customer service approach has really worked well for our farm. With the CSA, when the pandemic hit, that plan all got blown up, as happened on many farms, because the restaurants all closed on about March 15 or March 16.
Right. In the book, you talk about how you are planting tomatoes with certain restaurant customers in mind, right? When Rachel came out and said, "Hey, all the restaurants are closing." So sorry to interrupt you, but that was a great anecdote from the book.
I was literally planting 600 tomato plants in the greenhouse. She was in the house listening to the radio. I heard Governor Holcomb, Indiana's governor, come on the radio and announce that the restaurants all had to close. And I'm a stubborn mule. And I was like, no way in hell am I going to not plant these tomatoes. I nursed them to 7 weeks of life. They're perfect. I spent a ton of money on Vermont compost and, the seeds, and we can't just throw these in the ditch. So I finished the row I was working on. But then Rachel's like, okay, finish that row, come in the house. And I went in the house. We had this conversation. We got Nicole on the phone too. And we had a three-way talk about, okay, what are we going to do here with our farm? And decided to start a CSA, but to do the Genchi Genbutsu approach with it. Genchi Genbutsu translates to up close personal observation to thoroughly understand the situation. So when Toyota would hire an engineer, Tichi Ono's the manager of Toyota at the time, he used to sometimes draw a small circle in the middle of the shop floor and have an engineer stand in that circle for hours at a time before he is or she is allowed to begin work. And that's to say, observing and slowing down at the beginning, really understanding the situation is important. So we talked to potential CSA customers in person and asked them, hey, if we're going to pivot to CSA model here during a pandemic, can you help us design it? What do you want? And long story short, what came out of that process was with our set of customers here, what they wanted was a no contact, direct to your porch, no waste CSA. And so what happens is we harvest our food into Rubbermaid totes, these 10 or 14 gallon totes. Let's say there's carrots and turnips and salad mix. And we'll have 6 or 8 items in a CSA. But we'll put those items in, we'll hose them quick, put them in the tote. We're not going to band them. No twist ties, no plastic. And put those totes in the delivery vehicle. And then Nicole typically drives around. We'll show up in someone's house, and she will move items from the tote to a cooler that we've asked customers to set on their porch. And literally that's it. It saves us a ton of time having to band and package and put CSA boxes together. Of course, we were spending several $1,000s a year on boxes and packaging supplies that we don't have to spend that money. And then for the customer too, they get their food right on their porch, and it doesn't bother them one iota to not have plastic wrapped around their food. And because it's so fresh, we're harvesting in the morning, delivering in the afternoon.
And you haven't gone to the drones yet to drop off the food same day?
Working on that. No, we haven't got to that point. But I will say that with the greens, we are a greens farm, as you can see behind us. We've got kale and Asian greens and salad mixes and head lettuce. With the greens, we say put out a Tupperware of whatever size you want, and we'll fill it with salad mix or spinach or herbs. They have 3 Tupperwares. And so it's choose your own amount, CSA. And all we ask is that they be consistent from week to week so that we can predict how much to harvest. And so that first week is always a little bit is about figuring out how much we're going to need to supply on a weekly basis. But after that, it's predictable in terms of the amount we need to harvest, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we have customers who put out 2 gallons, 3 gallons worth of Tupperwares that they want filled with greens. And we have others who maybe set out a yogurt cup. That's fine. That way they're getting the amount they want, which is an important value attribute. No one wants to waste food. And it's more valuable if the customer have the right amount than to have a gargantuan amount.
Wow. Okay. So you have, I'm getting my head around this. So you have customers who put out a yogurt container for greens and some that put out 2 to 3 gallons. I mean, that's great that they're eating that much greens. How do you figure out pricing for that? Is it like the yogurt container people?
It's all one price.
Even out the 2 or 3 gallon of greens people, and like you just do it week to week. And like, do you figure if you have a customer come on or not? Do you have a certain amount of greens that you figure you need to add in order to meet that person? Like,
yeah, I mean, I should clarify, 2 or 3 gallons might be a bit of an exaggeration. I mean, one of these big, popcorn bowls.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know. I don't know how much you fill in that, but we do have customers putting those sizes of containers in.
Yeah. Well, still, just I'm thinking about on the farmer end of things to figure out production and pricing. Just yeah, tell us how that works. For I mean, it's a really cool system, but it's different. So that's what I want to know about. That's what I figure listeners will want to know about.
Well, we've done this 3 years in a row, and every season it is average that customers on average want between a third and a half a pound a week.
Mm-hmm.
Some will want closer to 1 pound, 1.5 or 2, and others will want much less. But it always averages out between a third and a half, and so that's how we budget and plan for how much to produce.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, and so another thing I wanted to ask you about is in the book you talk about you have certain targets for production. Like I think you say you are trying to produce at least $5 per square foot and pack at least $150 per hour of product. And so I was curious to ask A, do you hit those targets most of the time? And B, how often do you measure those things to see if you're on track?
So it's pretty simple. The square foot, we just open up QuickBooks, look at what the revenues have been divided by 15,000 square feet, and we can see how we're doing on that one. We just did that last week, and we're at over $5 a square foot, and we still have a couple months to go in the season. So we're going to hit that one this year.
You're already over the line.
Yeah, $150 to harvest in 1 hour of time would mean that from the time you grab a knife, we have these magnets around the property that hold our knives using the 5S organizing system. But from the point in time which you grab a knife to the point in time which is in the van, ready to go to the customer, let's say it's turnips or carrots or tomatoes or whatever, could one worker harvest that amount of product in an hour's worth of time? And I don't keep track of that every single harvest, but if we are going to be adding a new product, then I want to make sure it's going to hit that target.
Okay. So, right. So you might do that when you add a new product, make sure that it works out, and then just figure if you're following all these other systems that you have in place, it's probably going to keep tracking on that kind of profitability.
That's right. The first time we grow it, I'll be tracking the square foot harvest or the dollar amount per square foot at first season pretty closely too. If it's a greens, like let's say it's a new type of spinach, you can mark off a square foot pretty easily, cut it and go and see what's the dollar value of what we just cut off of a square foot. Not difficult to figure that one out. If it's a new type of tomato or something, that's a little more of a challenge. For that, I would keep track of revenues throughout the season and then divide by the square footage.
Okay.
So importantly, though, we don't spend a lot of time on this stuff. I don't want to people to think that you read the Lean Farm book and then you have a million spreadsheets to fill out. T.G. Ono, and I keep quoting him, but he used to say that costs do not exist to be calculated. Costs exist to be eliminated. And he used to be, let me say that again. It's one of my favorite quotes. Costs do not exist to be calculated. Costs exist to be eliminated. If you know it's a cost, just fricking get rid of it. Why put it under a microscope and analyze it and debate about it and have a team meeting about it? And he rubbed heads with the accounting department all the time because why crunch numbers? Why do any number crunching beyond what these simple, in lean circles they call head metrics, beyond what you can quickly do in your head? There's almost no reason to spend all winter behind spreadsheets.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to ask about how you're tracking those metrics. And I mean, I'm glad to hear that you're not out there like doing the math all the time, right? Because those metrics are important to keep you on track. On the other hand, yeah, you don't want to spend your time. You want to spend your time harvesting, planting. You don't want to spend your time figuring out how productive you were in your last hour. But
yeah, and really, those are the only ones we use. And the third one would be a transportation metric where we'd like to have the van filled with at least $600 worth of product before it leaves the property here. Okay. And that's easy to figure out too. We just simply add up the invoices that we've generated for the product in the van and make sure that tops 600. And sometimes it doesn't. We don't always hit that metric, but that's a target for us that helps us redesign our delivery routes so that we're being as efficient as we can. Maybe when Nicole does CSA deliveries, we'll tack on 1 or 2 restaurants deliveries with that if the target's not being met, that sort of thing.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. One of the things that you say in the book that I like a lot is you say, and I'm quoting here, that lean and get small principles put together have leveled the playing field, allowing our tiny farm to support our family in that same way that 400 acres of commodity crops supported my family growing up, end quote. So that is amazing to think about, going from growing 400 acres of crops to support a family to a third of an acre. But I think it's very important too, because I think it should give people points of entry into farming, right? Because
Sure.
it's a lot easier to start up farming thinking I'm going to support my family on, say, a third of an acre, than thinking like, well, I have to get the use of 400 acres and then I need the tractor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because I think one of the things keeping some people who might otherwise want to farm out of farming is access to land. And so, one of the overarching ideas of your book is you really don't need that much land.
And you don't need many tools, and you don't need a lot of supplies too. You can start up at a low cost. The last chapter in the book is a concrete, detailed plan for how to earn $20,000 from your backyard using just a handful of tools. It's a very doable proposition. It just takes a different mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is, I think that's probably also important to point out about the book, is the first part of your book is basically like the ideas underlying getting micro, or getting tiny, as you call it a number of times in the book. And then the last half is sort of like where the rubber meets the road. It's like, it's talking about the tools. It's talking about how you do your bed flips. It's got that plan. Right. So, which I think is really helpful, because if somebody's there thinking about taking the leap, it's a blueprint. It's like, here you go. You like, it should give people the confidence to take that leap. I sure hope it does. Because I know from reading your book, one thing you want, and one thing we want here at GFM, and probably all the other local food people out there, is more farmers to, increase that, 1%, and increase that even smaller percentage of the food that's coming from local sources in this country.
That's right. In a town the size of Goshen, 40,000, there are just a small handful of small farms servicing that town. But I can envision a day where we have dozens, if not hundreds, of micro scale farms, people growing food in backyards, and their suburban household using vacant lots. There's so much capacity, so many markets, so much opportunity if the pieces can all fit together. And I recognize I'm not trying to make it sound like this is the easiest career path, because it certainly isn't. It took me took about 8 years really of study and screwing up, about as long as it takes to become a doctor or a lawyer, to really feel you have a mastery of the craft to the point where you can feel confident going into the season that will come out with a living wage income. And we're not, like I said, we're not setting out to make a killing. I'm happy to make teacher salaries. Don't need necessarily those lawyer salaries. But if you're able to define enough, say, hey, this is enough income for me, and get small principles, then it really is possible to do this. There's an old Amish joke. I wonder if I can tell it for a minute, because it keys right into what you were saying. I'm a Mennonite, and so we can tell jokes about ourselves. But there was an English person who was looking to buy some land in this Mennonite community, and he wanted to buy 200 acres. He thought, be a sizable farm here. But he's a little worried that wouldn't be enough. So he goes up to this Mennonite farmer and he says, do you think I could make a living if I bought 200 acres of land out here? And that farmer pauses and he thinks and he says, well, I'm not sure. I know you can make a living on 20, but I don't know if you can make a living on 200 acres. So in other words, he has case study for making a living on a small patch of land, but it's riskier to make a living on a larger piece of land. It's the 400 and 500 acre farms. Those are the ones going out of business in the upper Midwest here. And the opportunity, as you say, in agriculture is the get small approach, and those farming on a part-time basis, doing it on a micro scale on a couple of acres or less.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in the book, you have a chart comparing the quote unquote smallest beautiful farm with the quote unquote never enough farm. And you have a number of attributes to the smallest beautiful farm, like set specific limits to growth. And for never enough farm, perpetual growth is the goal. And I've always thought that's one nice thing about having a small farm, is that it's not like a publicly traded corporation. You know what I mean? Where you'll be under a lot of pressure to grow the business every year. If you're a small farmer, you can decide what lifestyle you want. You can decide how much money you need to earn to support your farm or family, and shoot for that without pressure. Small farming should not be under that kind of pressure to grow every single year. You should need to get to the level to support yourself and your family, and then stabilize. And I guess that's what the rest of the book is about, is how to hit that target.
So yeah, a key here that we haven't talked about, and then I do want to, maybe if we have time to talk about the specifics of how we set up this farm and how we grow our food, I'm happy to do that. But the one key from that first half of the book that we haven't talked about is this this Swadeshi mindset. And that it's so important. And Swadeshi is a word that Gandhi is the first person attributed to having used the word. But the idea is to hyper localize your farm. And Gandhi defined Swadeshi as restricting yourself to the use and service of our immediate surroundings to the exclusion of the more remote. And so this is a restriction that you're purposefully placing around yourself. And it's a bit of almost a spiritual discipline for Gandhi. Like simplicity is to restrict yourself to what your community has available. But for Gandhi, though, importantly, he was a serial entrepreneur, starting presses, publishing companies, starting intentional communities. He even invented a two-wheel spinning wheel that would spin cloth twice as quickly as the conventional spinning wheels. So for him, part of Swadeshi was innovation, working smarter. And obviously an interest was independence from British colonial rule in India, but at a deeper level almost was this spiritual discipline of relying on your local community and working with your local community to do things better all the time. And like I said at the beginning, the Tao Te Ching says the reward of good work is productivity. And so just because you're using traditional methods, simple techniques and tools doesn't mean you have to sacrifice productivity. This is part of ancient wisdom that I'm wanting to tap into in this book. And so it's so important to set your limits. E.F. Schumacher and Gandhi really gave us some conceptual ideas for how to set our limits, draw some circles around our farm, but not to see those limits as constraints. The language I use is you want to leverage the constraints. Okay, just to give you two concrete examples, because if you see them as constraints, they will become weights on your shoulders that can depress your productivity on your farm. Okay, if you're going to say, I'm only going to work 35 hours a week, and you just cut yourself off at 35 hours and the weeds will take over. If you say, I'm going to shrink the size of my farm, but don't learn how to leverage the constraint of small size, then you will actually produce less food. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So here are two concrete examples of how to leverage a constraint and not just let it become a dead weight on your shoulders. The two highest costs on our competitors' farms, the large-scale farms growing greens out of California, Mexico, other places, their two highest costs are refrigeration and transportation, besides labor. Okay, and it's all about that, even on small farms, refrigeration and transportation. How can you cut down those costs? And so what we've done is we had these constraints of size in ours, but what we said we want to twist those constraints or leverage them to eliminate those costs. And so what we do is we harvest all of our food at 8 o'clock in the morning. We have it delivered by 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay, so we don't need to have walk-in coolers. We do have a room that's air conditioned. We have a mini split air conditioner in the room. It's cold. It's cool, very cool. But for that short amount of time, we're basically going from greenhouse or field to the delivery van with minimal amount of touches, and off it goes to the customer faster than the Amazon truck. And to restrict ourselves to 1.5 miles of the farm meant that we virtually eliminated our cost in transportation too, no more than a couple hours a week. So that's an example where you take a constraint, but you leverage it to actually cut costs. And we have much higher margins because of those two constraints.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. So how you can use your constraints to make your farm better rather than letting them limit your farm, which I thought was a very important idea that I enjoyed from the book.
That's right. So maybe you draw different circles than Rachel and I drew around your own farm. But the question to ask yourself, you have that constraint, that limit that's important to you for your lifestyle choice. Then next ask the question, how can I leverage this constraint to cut costs and do better for my customers?
Right. Well, and that's one of the things that I like about the book is that you talk about how you put it in place, but also sort of like with the lean system, you encourage people to do self-evaluation constantly, right? I figure you're showing people how you did it, but I know that you're assuming that the reader is going to come up with something maybe slightly different, right? Depending on what markets are around them, what is good to produce in their area, right? So I think that's one of the best things about the book is that people are going to take it and change it to be relevant to their own farms.
Well, that's my hope. I don't want the tone. I tried very hard for the tone not to be something like, we had these problems. We found this system and now it's all perfect. I've got it all figured out. Just do what I'm doing here. Instead, I tried very hard for the tone to read more like, we screwed up on our farm. We're recovering. And here's what's worked. For what it's worth, here's what's worked for us. These are the principles that I genuinely think could work for you too.
Mm-hmm. Which is more valuable, is giving people the information to make the decisions on their farm, instead of saying like, this is how I did it, just do it the way I did it. So I think that's one of the things that makes your book really valuable to people, is it gives them the tools to evaluate their own circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks.
All right, so I want to give you a chance to talk about. You just mentioned that you wanted. Do you want to talk some more about the production ways that you implemented these things on your farm? Because I got a ton of questions for you here, probably more than we have time for, and so I want to make sure, if there's something that is specific that you want to talk about, I want to make sure that we get to that.
Again, it's a bit specific to our case, but it was really important for us, for productivity, to switch to what we call the deep mulch system here. And what we do is collect. When we first purchased this bare piece of land, we tilled one time the plots that we wanted, where we wanted to grow food. And then we moved 4 inches of compost and layered that compost directly on the surface. Okay. And what that did for us was give us years of minerals. It cut costs because we don't ship in minerals and fertilizers for our crops. The compost is plenty sufficient. As you can see behind me here, there's nothing growing in this field. The only fertility source in this field were leaves from trees from within 1.5 miles of our farm. We said, if it's important to sell food only with 1.5 miles, then why shouldn't it be equally important to apply that metric or that limit to stuff that comes onto the farm? And so, especially with fertility, we keep it close, and we have this lady collects leaves and brings them to our farm at no cost. And then the Goshen Brewing Company here that we deliver food to gives us spent brewing grains that we add to that compost too. So it's all stuff from around here, which makes it possible to do the system. I recognize that in a lot of places in the U.S., people won't have access to low cost or free carbonaceous materials for making compost. However, we've really switched to becoming a full-on compost farm. And then once a year, we'll add another 1 inch of compost to the soil surface to keep feeding the microbes in the soil. And that's the engine that makes it all work here. The fungal networks keep the soil loose. We have excellent weed suppression because 4 inches is an excellent mulch. And that's been just a powerful driver of productivity on our farm, is to rely on the microbes and to cut out the minerals trucked in from other places.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. And I do think that system allows people to simplify a lot. Also, in the book, you talk about thinking ahead and to farm like a tree and work ahead, including tarping beds 2 weeks ahead of time when you need to plant them, to give the crop time to completely die before planting again. Do you ever intend to flip beds from one crop to another faster intentionally? Or would you consider the extra work to get those beds flipped faster, like some people talk about flipping a bed within a day, added work due to poor planning by not giving yourself enough time to let the crop die on its own and essentially do a lot of the work of previous crop removal for you?
Yeah, well, I say farm like a tree because before, we planted a bit of a fruit orchard here, and it just takes an incredible amount of patience waiting for those first fruits to arrive. And to be honest, we're still waiting. They all frosted out last year. But the reality is, trees spend years in advance preparing for their productivity, and we can't afford to spend years doing that. But it is important to not expect it to be productive immediately, but you need to plan ahead to put those pieces in place. And how trees do it, we're trying to actually make our systems mimic what happens in nature. So the way annuals grow in nature around here is that trees drop their leaves. Well, first of all, they suck minerals from deep within the earth, deposit those minerals in their leaves. Those leaves fall down at the end of the year, and they create a mat on the surface and decompose. And there's a slow drip of minerals into the soil around trees. And as those leaves decompose, eventually the annual seeds will be able to blow in and take purchase and germinate. Okay. So a tree didn't even freaking move and it's able to, quote unquote, be a farmer and have this incredible canopy of crops underneath it, including annuals. And here we are working our butts off and having crop failures. So something's going wrong here. But the idea is to mimic that system as best we can. So what we're doing is, when I say making compost, it barely counts as compost. We're turning those leaves just 2 or 3 times. I like Richard Wisbaum's low input composting method, and you can look that up online, and he spells out the steps. But essentially, it's a minimum number of well-timed turns instead of 5, 6, 10 turns where you're using expensive equipment and over pulverizing the leaves. So we're really touching the leaves just as little as we need to so that we practically can get them spread. Okay, if it's just leaf matted, then we can't really move them, but turn them just enough that we can move them, and then they can help provide weed suppression. And then we'll do this in the fall, normally in the late fall or winter when the ground's frozen, and let those leaves decompose. And by springtime, definitely transplants, and by May or June, seeds will be able to take purchase into them. And what we're doing there is using compost at its peak. When you have compost that's 5, 7, 10 years old, a lot of the minerals have been washed out. It might be nice and cake fluffy to touch. Our compost is not cake fluffy. It's not necessarily pleasant to touch at first because you still have twigs and chunks of leaves in there, but it continues to break down in the field. Point is that we use it when it's at its peak. It might be about 80% composted instead of at 100% composted, and to use it within 1 year of receiving the leaves. Ideally, we're not letting it sit around the property for several years. Get it here, turn it a couple of times, and get it on the field and start using it.
Yeah, so that's part of how you've really, as you talk about in the book, woven yourself into the fabric of the community. You're selling close to the farm. Your fertility is now, it's all compost. So that's which is pretty unusual. I mean, right? I mean, in the farming world, most people are buying off farm inputs, and so you're just using compost now.
That's correct, and not paying a cent for it. So besides, we have an ancient skid loader that we bought used that we use to turn the compost. So that's our cost, which is easily paid off. But we're lucky because we have a supportive community, in terms of customers who really demand our food, and then supportive in terms of the city was willing to work with us to bring the leaves out here. Mm-hmm. You had asked about bed flipping, and I think that's an important piece of this fertility system too. You see the beds of greens that are behind me here. Most of these, what we'll simply do is when we're done with our harvest, these are all cut and come again crops. My best tip, if you're wanting to be high profit on a small scale, is to focus on those crops where you plant the seed once and harvest lots of times, instead of crops like broccoli and cauliflower where you plant the seed once and harvest once. Anyhow, so these are crops that we've gotten 6 or 8, sometimes 10 harvests off of before we're going to turn them in. By turn them in, what we'll simply do, well, I'll tell you, our old practice was we'd pull the crops up by hand. We'd walk them 100 paces or so to a compost, turn them 5 or 6 times, then walk them back to the field and spread out the compost, which makes no sense because it's not how trees would do it. What we're doing here is simply smothering the crops, okay? Trees would do it with matted leaves. We're going to use silage tarps that we cut into small pieces. I cut mine down to 14 feet by whatever bed length we have, and it's 75 feet bed length here because one person, me, I can handle a small tarp like that, cover 2 beds at a time, or cover 1 bed if we need to, and just flip it over. And then weight that tarp down with sandbags. And we're not even going to mow the crop usually. We'll just simply cover the crop. And in summer, within a week, the crop is cooked and melted. And it's a bit like Bakashu fermenting, this Japanese composting method where you deprive oxygen to the compost, and that increases the fermentation. And just like kimchi that you might make on your counter in your house has some benefit to our gut system, there's something about fermenting these crops out in the field here that is a benefit too. I've seen it. Microbial activity is increased. And if we deprive oxygen to the crop and ferment the crop, the next crop is bigger. It does grow faster. And I'm not sure what it is. It's an area where there's a lot of new research and study. And it's exciting to see people get more interested in that. However, to smother the crop takes about a week. In the fall and the spring, it might take 3-4 weeks, if the sun's not out and it's colder. And in the winter, it can take a couple of months, obviously. But that's it. So we're composting in situ, essentially, composting in place, and pulling back the tarp. We'll rake the debris, if needed, into the path, and then simply grow the next crop. So I call it 2-step bed preparation. I detail all this in the book, but it's cut out an enormous amount of work on the farm.
Yeah, it's a really good system. And also, so that is the chapter that's going to be excerpted in the November Growing for Market magazine, the two-step bed flip. So people get the magazine, we'll see that. Even if you don't get the magazine, we're going to make that free. So people definitely look in the show notes or go to growingformarket.com. You can read that, the chapter we're talking about right now, as an article that Ben and Chelsea Green, the publisher, were kind enough to allow us to excerpt for the magazine. In addition to not using purchased fertilizers, one thing I think people might find surprising is that you stopped rotating crops. Can you tell us a little bit about why you stopped doing crop rotation?
For the most part, it's because we didn't need to. And again, this is an area of new research, but you see the kale in the corner here. I'll point my pen to it. Am I pointing the right direction somewhere along here? So I've grown kale 3 years in a row in that same location. And the reality is microbes sometimes like to develop long-term relationships. These are living organisms. They sometimes like to develop long-term relationships with a parent crop. I'm not sure if that's the right term or not, but with the cash crop that we're introducing. And to be honest, I just didn't see the growth benefit crop rotating. Now, having said that, we're not growing sweet corn on top of sweet corn on top of sweet corn, heavy feeders one right after the other. Though I think we probably could with our deep mulch system, our fertility levels would be high enough to get away with that. So it's a benefit of deep mulching that we have consistently high fertility everywhere on the farm. We can plant whenever and wherever we want. You see, there is a bed that with a tarp right here. So there's a bed here being tarped using that two-step bed flipping method. And what will go in there will be whatever makes sense at the time. I don't have a spreadsheet that delineates that X crop will go in X bed on July 30th. Okay. So what I will plant, I do have a rough idea. I know how many beds of kale I want, how many beds of intercut would be a Salanova type cut and come again lettuce. That's probably our best selling crop on our farm right now. It really goes fast and is heavily productive. So I have a sense of how many beds of intercut I want, how many beds of kale, tomatoes. I know how many beds I want, but I don't know where they're going until the time comes. And so I will fill that vacancy here with whatever makes the most sense economically at the time.
That is interesting in itself because, as you know, a lot of people are more precise about that. But it sounds like that also probably is very fluid and might open things up for you. So I want to ask you about the intercut. That's just like a Salanova type lettuce, in that it's just a different company's take on that.
That's right. It's a different company. A multi-leaf would be another term they use for those types of head lettuces that are bred for salad mix. You can cut them up for salad mix, or you can grow them as heads too. In our trials, intercut has been the most productive because you can grow it in the summer. We have unpredictably higher heat than normal than we had been experiencing when we started farming 16 years ago. And intercut takes all 4 seasons, grows well in the winter too, and it's heavy. It weighs up nicely.
Oh, that's always a bonus. So people are going to be interested in that, I think, because I hear a lot of people growing in the Salanovas, but baby greens is such an important crop for so many farms. Who are you getting the intercut from? What seed companies? Johnny's has intercut?
Yeah, Johnny's also that. Mm-hmm.
Cool. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, Ruby Go is the other one. Intercut's a light green, and Ruby Go is a red. And Ruby Go does well in all 4 seasons too. Like I said, we try to simplify our farm, and part of that means simplifying our variety selection. So instead of growing 200 varieties, we're now just have a small handful and 5 focus crops. But Ruby Go and intercut, those two in combination make a beautiful solid mix that sells like hotcakes around here, with beautiful color. The texture is nice, and like I said, we can do it all year.
Great. Can you just tell us a minute about the soil test that you do and trends you're seeing over time after moving to no-till? I know you were talking, maybe it was to dispel some skepticism that people might have for just growing in leaf compost. In the book, you talked about, I think, doing a traditional soil test, and then maybe you also talked about doing a Solvita or some of the other soil tests that take into account like respiration as an indication of biological activity in the soil and stuff like that. And I know you said your indications were trending up over time. Can you just tell us a little bit about what soil tests you're using and the trends that you're seeing with this system?
Well, yeah, when we first purchased this piece of land, I knew the land had been overused, had been there's a pasture out here, had been cut, and fertility never replenished for at least 20 seasons, and the land had less than 1% organic matter, and the soil didn't hold together. there was no glomalin in it. In what that glomalin is what bacteria would produce that helps to hold soil together, and it would just would slip right through your hands. And so we really couldn't grow crops without amending it heavily. And we're well over 10% organic matter on the farm, and using metrics of traditional soil tests. And then all the minerals are at sufficient levels. However, I'm more interested in these traditional soil tests are based with it on a chemistry mindset, and the idea being that it's a game of deficiencies and inputs. And so, if you're deficient in a mineral, then you go purchase it, and some company has mined it and will supply the mineral that you're deficient in. That's just a different mindset that we're wanting to get away from here. And not just us, but there's a lot of other farmers wanting to move to more of a biological mindset. And so there are new soil tests that people are trying to figure out, how do you measure the biology that's in a soil? It's a little bit trickier to do because there are a billion microbes in a teaspoon of soil. We have named fewer than 10% of them. So there's much more we don't know than that we do know. However, the way I think of it is, and I'll be honest, the articles in Growing for Market have been really helpful in my understanding of this, because I don't have time to research all the new science coming out, but you guys have done a good job of publishing this. But by my thinking, the fungal network's important. So the fungi help to hold they're like 2x4s in a house that hold your soil up. And it's the reason why over-tilling doesn't make sense. It's like taking a chainsaw through your house, cutting through the 2x4s in your house, and it'll collapse. It won't hold up. And so if you don't till for a period of years and your fungal networks become very developed, we can now go 4 to 6 inches with our hand anywhere on our farm, and it's nice and loose without having had to till it. And the fungal network, fungi too, will actually drill into the roots of your plant, making it possible for minerals to inject minerals into your plants. That's how intimately connected they are with the plant life above soil. The bacteria are important for glomalin production, and there are a whole host of other microbes that actually consume or that eat bacteria and fungi, and that make minerals available to plants. So it's complex relationships going on down there. And how do you measure it, though? We use the Haney test, and the Haney test relies on a number of metrics, but one of them is measuring the amount of carbon dioxide. Many of these microbes they're little animals, and so they're breathing, and they breathe off and they breathe out carbon dioxide, which you can measure. And those tests came in very high for us too. And I don't remember those numbers offhand. But to be quite honest, now that we know that we're good with our system here and we're relatively consistent with our compost process and compost ingredients, it's been more than 2 years since I've taken either one of those types of tests. We have confidence in our plants. And if I see spinach starting to yellow, spinach is the best indicator crop that I've seen. If it starts to look weak and yellow, especially around the tips, then there's probably a nitrogen deficiency, and it might be time to add some minerals. But just by looking at crops and Mizuna and to some extent the darker leaf lettuces, you can see when minerals are needed, and with growth rates too. That's another way to read your plants. If Mizuna should be about 22 days to harvest, and if you're stretching out to 30, 32 days, then you have lagging growth, and it might be time to add some compost or think about remineralizing somehow.
Mm-hmm. All right. So if you're just using compost, do you keep any, liquid fertilizers or anything on hand for when growth slows down or you see yellows? Or are you cut the crop that's kind of slow and do an early side dress of compost? Like you were saying, started out with 4 inches and then add an inch every year. Would you just add compost earlier if things seem yellow and like they're slowing down?
If things look like they're yellowing, then we'll probably tarp that crop and wait a week or two in the summer. After we pull back the tarp, we would add a top dressing of compost before we planted the next crop. That would be the remedy we'd take.
Sounds good. Well, at some point in the book, you say I hope that these pages inspire millions, and I think this book will. And of course, that's our hope here at GFM as well, and a lot of the other local agriculture advocates as well. To people who are out there listening and thinking about starting a farm and perhaps wondering if their current property is big enough to support themselves, or trying to buy or lease land and wondering how much land they need, this should be a very hopeful book because it shows how you can support yourself from farming without a whole lot of land. People can do this on lots the size of many houses are already on, and I hope it lowers the barriers to people getting into farming because it gives the plan for farming without having to acquire a larger traditional farm property with a lot of acreage. I think the point is you don't have to have a lot of land to support yourself from a farm. What you have to do is make the most of what you have and keep overhead and waste down by keeping things simple. To people who might be thinking about starting a farm, I feel like this book is saying to them, take the leap. Is there anything else you would like to say to people out there who are thinking about starting a farm?
Well, one of my inspirations is Booker T. Whatley. He was at the Tuskegee Institute and said, smaller and smarter is the way to make a profit. And for your first year of growth, choose 4 crops and choose just 2 accounts, maybe a restaurant and a CSA or a restaurant and a farmer's market. Focus on 4 crops and 2 accounts. It's easier to get bigger and to grow from there. And that's a better way to start than to start with too much and to downsize. I've done that approach, but start small and smart, and that's the way to farm.
All right, I just want to ask if people are listening and they're digging this, but they don't want to get that small. Would you recommend them just go read your first lean farm book if they just want to make their farm more efficient without going micro?
That's right, because lean is a system that can apply to any size and type of operation. Okay, it is neutral on the question of size. Many businesses will use lean to get bigger, in fact. And I wrote that first book to apply to any size and type of farm. Certainly applies to small scale produce farms like ours, but I've heard from large scale cattle producers. I've heard from people outside of agriculture, people running podcast studios, potters, all kinds of folks say these principles actually bleed out of agriculture and apply really well in my line of work too. So that book is very general in that sense, explaining how to apply the lean system to your small business, but especially within agriculture. The lean micro farm is layering some Gandhian thought and E.F. Schumacher principles onto lean to say, how do we take these lean ideas and shrink the size of your business without taking a pay cut?
Yeah. Okay. Because I wanted to make sure and I thought that's what you would probably say is like, okay, if you don't want to go micro, just go read the original lean farm book. And if you're going vegetables, the follow up with all the vegetable specific stuff, because we enjoyed those books and applied those techniques to try to make our own farm more efficient, which was worthwhile. And I just think, growing for market, we have a lot of very small farms. At the same time, we also have bigger farms that aren't necessarily trying to get that small. And we want to honor, all of the sizes, of course, because I realized some, back when I was apprenticing on farms, I worked on a vegetable farm that had, I think, 100 acres in production, including something like 20 acres of cover cropping, because that was an important part of the farm. And I'll say that's also how I learned that I didn't want to have a farm that big. But the guy who ran that farm was a real go-getter and wanted to be selling volumes to grocery stores and things like that. And that was great. But that's also a good thing about apprenticing on farms, because you can learn a lot, including learning what you don't want. And so I always, after that, I knew, I learned a ton on that farm, but I also, one of those things was that I did not want to have a farm that was just more beyond the scale that I wanted. So I want to point out your ideas. This most recent book is really applicable to small farms, but the lean ideas, I just want to make sure people realize the lean ideas aren't just for really the tiny farms, as you call them in the book. They can be applied to making a farm of any size really more efficient, I think. So I think when we look at the agriculture system that we're in right now, with a vast, like you say, only about 1.3% of the people are farming in the USA anymore. And the vast majority of the food that is consumed in the country is coming from, bigger, more industrial situations. It can seem really daunting, like how could anybody ever break into that market share? Like greens, for example. Like I think you rightly have greens on your list of important, one of the like 5 important crops that you narrowed down for your farm. And that's pretty good advice. A lot of small farms rely on greens. And so when you hear things like 80 or 90% of the greens for the whole country coming out of California, it can seem like a juggernaut. Like, how could I ever break into that? On the other hand, you're showing, by the way, in your book that you found those local outlets. Well, I look at that, that's market share that small farms can take, and they don't have to get big to, like, nobody can compete with the Central Valley of California. There's a reason so many greens. I think that's, like the industrial economic mindset would say, find the best place to produce a particular crop, make it all there, and ship it everywhere else. And we're saying, no, most parts of the country, you can grow greens almost year round with minimal or maybe a little bit of heat. It means find the places that are growing that lettuce coming from California, and make friends with them, and take that market share. So I love the fact that I think you're giving people ideas of how to do that, how to tap into that market share. I also like how you call it like it is. At some point in the book, you say, plus consider the fact that the food of the macro ag world is crap. Because bravo, Ben, because sometimes I feel like I'm speaking too strongly, and that's what I want to say. But if I had to say what our ag system in this country is it's basically like factory farming, the raw ingredients for processed food, whether that be for animals or people. It's like there's so much corn and soy made that's basically just through the subsidy system. It's, if farmers may produce it at a loss because they know they're going to make it up with a subsidy, and then that food just gets, it's bad for the environment the way it's produced, and then it's bad for the people on the eating end. So I think we share the same vision as far as wanting to. I do hope millions of people read this book, get inspired to go start a micro farm or a medium farm or whatever size farm on whatever land they have at their disposal, and actually, I mean, I didn't even think of this, but like Gandhi said, to be the change you want to see in the world. If people, I think that's a lot of what draws people to farming, is be inspired to be, they see the things that are wrong with our agricultural system. And you don't need anything other than yourself to start a farm and to start being a part of that change. I've personally took a lot of inspiration from this book, and I'm really excited. I think other people will too. So good job on the book, Ben. And we have been talking for quite a while. So I just wanted to both thank you and ask you if there's anything that I should have asked you about, or is there anything else you'd like to say before we let you go?
No, I think you covered all the key points. I would say just that I want to give people a word of encouragement that this book is really, if you're thinking about starting a farm, being a part-time farmer, or being a micro scale farmer, there are on-ramps. And I hope that this book shows you in plain language how you can start a farm no matter where you are on a tiny patch of land. And it's the world's most rewarding career, like I said earlier. And I hope you'll join me and thousands of others and grow food for your local community. The food of the macro ag world, to say it's crap is putting it mildly. It's frankly, it's bull. It's killing us. Childhood obesity rates have never been higher. And it only exists because of a multi-billion-dollar subsidy system that keeps it in place. And the way I look at it is just like the lean system is a coin, there's two sides on it. Either what you're doing in your farm is making your community a healthier place, or it's making it less healthy to live in. And there's nothing more rewarding than being on the side of the coin that makes your community contributing to the health of your community. So I hope you'll take up the cause, grab a packet of seeds, put those seeds in the ground, and start growing.
Yeah, there you go. All right. Get started, people. I mean, I think a lot of our audience already is, but I think we probably have a lot of people who are listening because they need information. And so, yes, those people who are out there thinking about it, take the leap. There's a good guide right here. Lastly, Ben, where can people find you on social media or wherever you want people to find you?
Once or twice a week, I'll put up an Instagram post on Clay Bottom Farm showing these techniques in practice. And then our website has a lot of free information on it too. And there are links to purchase books and, of course, the masterclass and other resources on that website. It's claybottomfarm.com.
Okay, super. Well, thanks again, Ben. You've been very generous with your time. I really enjoyed it. And I also really enjoyed the book. So thank you so much for both of those things, and take care. And maybe we'll have you back on the podcast one of these days.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks for having me.
Great. All right. Thanks, Ben.
All right. Take it easy.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Growing for Market podcast. If you've been enjoying the show, please consider giving us a follow and a rating or a review. It really helps others find the podcast. For more tips and tricks from farmer to farmer, check out our magazine at growingformarket.com. Whether you're a commercial grower or just want to grow like one, subscribe to Growing for Market magazine for the nitty-gritty of growing, marketing, and the business of market farming. We publish 10 issues per year with articles written by experienced farmers on topics ranging from tools and techniques to farm business operations and marketing. If you've been listening to the Growing for Market podcast and haven't yet checked out Growing for Market magazine, we've made a change so you can try the magazine for free. We've added a free month to the beginning of all first-time subscriptions. Try out the digital or paper magazine subscription for a month, and if it's not for you, cancel within 28 days and you'll never get billed. Even the most basic subscription gets you a year of the magazine, plus 150 back issues from the last 15 years. With digital subscriptions starting at just $30 per year, head on over to growingformarket.com and subscribe today to benefit from over 3 decades of writing by farmers for farmers in Growing for Market magazine.